Today, as I mentioned, we celebrate the great solemnity of Corpus Christi, one of my favorite solemnities throughout the year, not only because I was ordained June 1st 5 years ago, but also my first Mass was celebrated on the Feast of Corpus Christi, so it will always have a very special and dear significance to me since it was sort of the initiation of my priesthood. I could probably talk for several hours on different aspects of the Eucharist, but I'm not going to. I want to focus on one very important one today. So oftentimes, because we don't believe very often that faith and science can be reconciled. We've been given this false division that somehow faith is something that's in the mind and in the heart, but in reality it makes no difference. The great 13th century philosopher and theologian St. Thomas Aquinas once said, "To those who believe, no explanation is necessary, and to those who do not, no explanation is possible." He said that in regard to miracles. That when one comes in contact with a miracle, to those who believe, no explanation is necessary. To those who do not, no explanation is possible. We gather today to celebrate the solemnity of Corpus Christi, which is our belief as Catholics that Jesus is present body, blood, soul, and divinity in the forms of bread and wine at the Mass when the priest, ordained validly by the bishop, says the consecration prayers over that bread and wine, speaking in the same words of Jesus, "This is my body, this is my blood." Do you believe that? More than 50% of Catholics in the last survey in the country said that they don't. It's no surprise then that many Catholics live as if the Eucharist were inconsequential to their lives. That what we do here is sort of separate from what we do in the rest of the world. But as you may know or not, is that when you struggle with things of faith, you should ask the Lord to help you with them. And he always does. Especially in regard to the Eucharist. There have been hundreds of Eucharistic miracles that have occurred throughout the world in the 2,000 years of history of the Church. The presence of Jesus in the Eucharist was never even doubted for the first 1,000 years of the Church, because they believe God, who could do anything, if he can change water into wine, he can certainly change bread and wine into his body and blood, his sacramental presence at Mass. But very oftentimes, even clergy and priests have had their own doubts. And so the Lord often furnishes miracles to help people with their faith. I don't want to talk about one particular for this homily. It's the miracle of Buenos Aires. Has anyone heard of the miracle of Buenos Aires? Eucharistic miracle? Okay, so maybe this will refresh your memory a little bit. In 1996, after Mass, a woman approached the priest and mentioned that she had seen a Eucharistic host that was set aside on a candle stand. The priest, as is the norm, went to retrieve the Blessed Sacrament, and as they're instructed to do, put it in a glass dish full of water that he had taken out of the tap. He then put the glass into the tabernacle and waited for the Eucharist to dissolve. Once the Eucharist loses its form of bread or wine, it loses its substantial presence of Christ. And so he waited for it to dissolve so he could eventually, as he said, water a plant with it or something like that. You know, if you ever got extra holy water, you're not supposed to put it down the drain. A good idea to water the plant. That's just a little note as you're gardening and stuff this spring. So he put that glass, and after 8 days he went to go check on it, but there was something different about the host. It had taken on a reddish color. Now, this has happened before, and the Church is always very cautious about proclaiming miracles because it doesn't want to make an absurdity for something that science can explain. So normally you'll hear of circumstances like this where there's some bacteria or something like that and some mold that forms. And so the Church is always very cautious, and no different in this case. And so the priest left it in the tabernacle and said, "There's something different." And he went to the Archbishop of the diocese in Buenos Aires at the time, who was none other than our Pope Francis. He was Bishop Jose Maria Bergoglio at the time. And he said, "There's something strange about this host." And after 8 days, the host did not dissolve, and it took on more and more of a reddish color each day. So the archbishop then instructed him to put it in a vial of distilled water and put a cap in it and leave it in the tabernacle. Or actually, he put it in the tabernacle in his house so it would be out of the way, and said, don't tell anyone about this. Why? Well, because people get excited about it and they proclaim miracle, and if it's not, then people say it's a fraud and the church looks bad. So the church is always the biggest scrutinizer when it comes to miracles. But after 3 years, in 1999, the vial was looked at again. It had not only increased in the host not dissolved, but it had become entirely red in color. The Archbishop, Jose Maria Bergoglio, at that time, asked that a doctor come in and examine the vial and have some of his friends or some of his colleagues tell them what it is. And so he sent that vial up to New York to a forensic pathologist and also a cardiologist to examine what it was. And so he didn't prejudice the study. He never told the doctor where the sample came from. He simply handed him the vial and he said, I've taken a sample of this. I want you to tell me what it is. So he did his investigation and eventually came back and he said, well, I can tell you what this is. There is the presence of human flesh here, specifically the heart tissue. From the left ventricle, the ventricle of the heart that contracts, which means it's the one that pushes the blood into the body. It's from the myocardium. And it's heart tissue. And I also noticed the presence of white blood cells, which is consistent with the fact that this person, when you have an injury or something like that, or something traumatic happens to your body, what happens is white blood cells rush there in order to bring it oxygen or something like that. But he said, I noticed the presence of white blood cells, which means two things: that this person had undergone some sort of severe trauma to the body, and they also were being asphyxiated, which means they weren't able to breathe properly. And so the body was in panic. And now I have a question for you, the doctor said. Where did you get this sample? He said, well, it was stored in a glass of tap water for 8 days and then put into a vial of distilled water for 3 years. And he said, that's impossible. And the guy said, why? Because the presence of white blood cells would completely evaporate after just a few minutes in water. And the other question I have for you is, where did you get this sample? Because the presence of white blood cells also means that wherever you took it from, the person was still living. And finally, Dr. Castagnan, who was the doctor who was asked by Pope Francis to send it to one of his colleagues, said this came from a host at Mass, at a Catholic Mass. And the doctor exclaimed, that is impossible. I can't explain it. To those who believe in the words of Jesus Christ when he says, this is my body, no explanation is necessary. To those who do not believe, no explanation is possible. The Church, in her caution, even in her caution, scientifically verified that this miracle of the host is something that science cannot explain, along with the doctor. That doctor eventually converted to Catholicism because of Eucharistic miracles. So it begs the question for us, friends, how do we approach the Eucharist? Theologically, it's clear that on the cross, the spear that opened the side of Jesus Christ spilled out water and blood poured out for us in the redemption of our souls. That's what the purification is talking about in our readings today. In the Old Testament, the Jewish people knew they needed to be cleansed, and they depended on the blood of a lamb in order to do that. But we as Christians in the New Testament era depend on the blood of the lamb that we receive sacramentally to keep our blood going even after our blood stops. The Mass is the representation again and again of Jesus' heart offered to you, over and over and over again. It doesn't work like medicine, because medicine doesn't work. If you take aspirin, aspirin doesn't depend on how much you really want the aspirin to work. It works regardless. The Eucharist, on the other hand, because God is very respective of our wills, only works in cooperation with him. That is the nature of a covenant. A contract is the exchange of goods or services. A covenant is the exchange of a person's very self. And that's what we celebrate at every Mass. The new and eternal covenant. So friends, today I posted a video on the internet on our homepage at the bottom that has a video describing this incident in more detail. It was only 2006 when the final documentation came out to certify this miracle in Buenos Aires, and it was published in a few Australian journals. There's very good reason why it wouldn't be published in every paper in the world, because people know what that would mean. That the Catholic Church is legitimately consecrating the Eucharist, and Jesus' words, "This is my body, this is my blood," are in fact true. I've also started a little wall out in the narthex. This has been a 3-year project that's been brewing in my mind that just shortly explains Eucharistic miracles around the world, and I want to keep it up for a while. So if you want to hear more details about this one, it's also up in the narthex on some boards that have been prepared and some posters, and I want to do some rotating of that, because many people who come to our church don't always understand what we're celebrating here, and I think they need to know. And we too, I can tell you when I was doing my research for this, at some point, my heart was really moved. Because very oftentimes, even as a priest, there's certain levels of depth that you believe in things. And certainly this renewed again my love of the Eucharist, especially since he's celebrating the anniversary of the priesthood and the day of my first Mass. So friends, I just want to leave you with the advice that Mother Teresa had hung on every sacristy of her chapels around the world. And it was a request of the priest, but I also make it of you today. It said, "Priest, dear priest, please say this Mass as if it was your first Mass. Please say this Mass as if it were your only Mass. And please say this Mass as if it were your last."